In the dark and brutal theater of medieval politics, where power was not just seized but often butchered into existence, few deaths were ever as poignant, as calculated, or as devastating as the end of Hugh Despenser the Younger. It was a death that transcended the mere execution of a man. It was a statement, an unforgettable performance designed to not only rid the kingdom of a tyrant, but to mark him as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with England. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of power, second only to the king himself, would be torn apart in ways that no one could have imagined, his screams echoing through the streets of Hereford like the sound of a kingdom's final breath. The crowds gathered not just out of morbid curiosity, but because they knew deep down this was more than the end of a life. This was the destruction of a legend, a man whose ambition had built an empire of fear and whose downfall would be remembered as a moment when the very core of political corruption was ripped open for all to see. For Hugh Despenser, the price of unchecked ambition was not just loss of power. It was a spectacle of torment, a lesson, an irrevocable downfall that would leave its scar on history. What had once been the careful manipulation of kings and nobles would be reduced to a public disembowelment, his very identity torn apart piece by piece. This was not just retribution, it was vengeance, a public execution to remind the kingdom of the cost of absolute power, of favor and corruption, and of the fine line between loyalty and destruction. In the unforgiving and merciless theater of medieval politics, where the fate of men was often decided not by diplomacy but by bloodshed, few deaths reverberated through history with the same magnitude as that of Hugh Despenser the Younger. His execution in November 1326 was not merely the end of a man. It was the brutal annihilation of an era, a calculated and deliberate act designed to dismantle everything he had worked for and leave behind nothing but the ashes of his ambition. This was a death unlike any other, not one of swift justice or quiet demise, but a spectacle, a performance meant to send shock waves through the kingdom to remind all who witnessed it of the dangers of absolute power, unchecked ambition, and the darkness that lurked at the heart of the political machine he had so ruthlessly built. Once, Hugh Despenser had stood at the pinnacle of English society. His rise had been meteoric, from the depths of minor nobility to become the second most powerful man in the kingdom, his influence stretching across every facet of governance. Despenser was no mere courtier. He was the king's shadow, the master behind the throne. Edward II, weak and consumed by his love for his favorites, had allowed Despenser to manipulate the course of England's destiny, to hold the reins of power with an iron grip. For over a decade, Despenser ruled not just as a trusted advisor, but as the true ruler of the realm, silencing his enemies with a combination of brute force, legal manipulation, and calculated political maneuvering. His ambition knew no bounds, and with each passing year, his grip tightened, suffocating the nobility and crushing any opposition. But in the cold and calculating world of medieval politics, no one, no matter how high they rise, is immune to the forces of retribution. Queen Isabella, once a pawn in Despenser's game, became the harbinger of his downfall. Humiliated and sidelined by his unchecked power, she made a calculated escape to France in 1325, using her exile to forge alliances with disgruntled nobles and exiles who had been crushed beneath Despenser's heel. By the time she returned to England in 1326, she had gathered an army, not just of soldiers, but of those who had suffered under Despenser's reign of terror. The Queen, once a passive figure, had become the symbol of resistance, the embodiment of revenge, and she was not alone. With the support of the nobles who had been silenced for so long, she launched an invasion, one that would sweep through England with the fury of a storm. The fall of Despenser came swiftly, with Edward II's court crumbling under the weight of his favorite's tyranny. Even those who had once been loyal to the king now turned against him. Despenser and his father, Hugh the Elder, were forced to flee westward, hoping to find refuge in the Welsh marches, where their power had once been strongest. But the support they had built their empire on had evaporated, and even in the remote regions of Wales, the Despensers found no sanctuary. The tide had turned, and Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured. His fate was sealed, not in the quiet confines of a prison cell, but in the open, where his death would become a public lesson, a horrific demonstration of the price of tyranny. The execution of Hugh Despenser in Hereford was not a simple affair. It was a meticulously orchestrated spectacle, a performance designed to break him in ways that would go beyond the physical and reach into the very core of his identity. This was not a man simply being punished for his crimes. This was a man being obliterated, his legacy, his life, his very essence torn from him before the eyes of the watching crowd. The people who had once lived in fear of his power, who had suffered at his hands, now stood ready to witness the fall of the man who had caused them so much pain. The execution was a form of justice, yes, but it was also a message, a statement to the rest of the kingdom about the cost of ambition, the dangers of corrupting the natural order, and the ultimate price that must be paid when one crosses the line from power into tyranny. On that fateful day in November, Despenser was brought before the crowds, his once proud form now a trembling shadow of the man he had been. He was stripped of his dignity and paraded through the streets, his body battered and humiliated, the crowd jeering and mocking him with every step. The executioners, carefully chosen for their skill in inflicting pain, began their work. The first stage of his punishment was a hanging, but not one that would end quickly. Despenser was left to dangle from the rope, his breath strangled from his chest, his body racked with agony. The crowd, once victims of his cruelty, cheered as his life hung by a thread. But this was only the beginning. The second phase was designed to break him utterly. With a mockery of his relationship with King Edward II, Despenser was castrated, his genitals severed and cast into a fire, a symbolic act that represented the severing of the unnatural bond between the two men. It was a grotesque and humiliating act, meant to strip Despenser of everything that had made him powerful. The connection he had once had with the king, the foundation of his rule, was being eradicated before the eyes of the crowd. What followed was even more horrific. His abdomen was sliced open, his entrails drawn out slowly and painfully, while he remained conscious, his body alive but broken. The crowd watched in morbid fascination as Despenser's very essence was torn from him, his heart cut out and thrown into the flames. This was not just an execution. It was the systematic destruction of a man's identity, a political statement that left no room for ambiguity. The final stage of the execution was the quartering, the last brutal act in the dismantling of Hugh Despenser. His limbs were tied to horses and torn from his body, his head severed and displayed on London Bridge as a warning to all who would dare follow in his footsteps. The remnants of his body were sent to various cities, a grotesque reminder of the price of ambition, a punishment so brutal that it left no doubt about the severity of his crimes. In the aftermath of his death, England was forever changed. The psychological impact of Despenser's execution was profound, not only on the people who had suffered under his rule, but on the very structure of English politics. The message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions. Despenser's death was a victory for the people, for Queen Isabella, and for the idea of justice. But it was also a chilling reminder of the dark, violent side of political power. It was a death that transcended the man, that became a symbol, a turning point in the history of medieval England. Hugh Despenser the Younger's execution was a grotesque spectacle, a carefully orchestrated political theater that would echo through the ages, not just for its cruelty, but for the lessons it imparted. It was a warning to all who would dare rise too high, too fast on the backs of others, that the higher the climb, the greater the fall, and the more terrible the price when the inevitable reckoning comes. In the shadowy, blood-soaked arena of medieval politics, few deaths carried the weight of spectacle and consequence like that of Hugh Despenser the Younger. His execution in November 1326 wasn't just the demise of a man, it was a deliberate, brutal dismantling of an entire political empire. It was a chilling message, not only to those who had suffered under his rule, but to all who would dare to believe that unchecked ambition and royal favoritism could ever go unpunished. Despenser, once the second most powerful man in England, had risen to heights few could dream of. His influence touching every corner of the kingdom, his grip on power so absolute that he had reduced even kings and nobles to mere pawns in his game. But the higher he climbed, the harder he fell, and his death would serve as a horrifying reminder of the price one pays for pushing too far. Hugh Despenser's rise to power was a story of cunning, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. Born into minor nobility in 1286, he inherited not only his father's name, but his sharp political instincts, quickly gaining favor with Edward II. Where others saw the king as weak and indecisive, Despenser saw an opportunity, an opening to insert himself at the heart of England's governance. By 1322, Despenser had wormed his way into the king's inner circle, rising from a trusted advisor to the king's most influential companion. His power was more than that of a court favorite. It was the quiet and insidious control over the kingdom's political machinery. Through deft manipulation of the king and his court, Despenser began to consolidate his power, stripping away the influence of the nobility and leaving behind a kingdom that answered only to him. For over a decade, Despenser ruled with near impunity. He destroyed his enemies, seized their lands, and stripped them of their dignity in the process. He employed a mix of legal maneuvering, economic pressure, and outright violence to eliminate any threat to his supremacy. His ambition had no boundaries, and as his power grew, so did his cruelty. The Welsh marches, once governed by semi-autonomous lords, became a focal point of Despenser's expansion. Through engineered conflicts and violent takeovers, he amassed lands and wealth that rivaled those of the king himself. But it was not enough. Despenser did not just seek power. He craved complete control. He didn't want to simply be a powerful advisor. He wanted to be the true ruler of England, the voice behind the throne, the hand that guided the king's every move. His ascent, however, was not without enemies. The nobility, though cowed by his influence, began to seethe with resentment at the growing reach of his power. Edward II, whose weakness had enabled Despenser's rise, found himself increasingly isolated, a puppet to the machinations of his favorite. The tipping point came when Queen Isabella, humiliated by her husband's submission to Despenser, began to plot her own rebellion. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. It was during her exile that she began to gather support from exiled English nobles and disillusioned courtiers who had been victimized by Despenser's reign. As she forged an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a key figure who had narrowly escaped Despenser's purges, the tide turned against the tyrant. Despenser, once so powerful, found himself increasingly isolated as his enemies began to rally around the queen. By 1326, Isabella had an army behind her, and Despenser's fall was imminent. His capture was swift. Fleeing with his father in the hopes of finding refuge in Wales, Despenser was eventually caught. His fate was sealed long before he was dragged before the Queen's forces. His death was no ordinary execution. It was a carefully constructed performance meant to punish him not only for his crimes, but for the fear and loathing he had inspired in so many. This would be no quick hanging or swift decapitation. The crowd in Hereford, drawn from all corners of England, was about to witness the ultimate humiliation of a man who had once commanded the very nation. The execution of Hugh Despenser was meticulously planned, each phase designed to strip him of his identity, his dignity, and his legacy. Stripped naked, Despenser was paraded through the streets of Hereford, his once proud form now a shattered image of weakness and disgrace. The crowd, many of whom had suffered under his reign of terror, jeered and mocked him, throwing refuse at his trembling body. It was a public spectacle designed to break him in front of all who had once feared him, but the true horror was only beginning. Despenser was hanged by the neck, but not until death. The rope was carefully adjusted to prolong his suffering, leaving him gasping and choking before the crowd. It was a calculated form of torture meant to break him physically while the crowd savored each agonizing moment. When Despenser was cut down, still alive but barely conscious, the second stage of his execution began. In a grotesque mockery of his relationship with Edward II, Despenser was castrated. His genitals were severed and thrown into the fire, a symbolic act of cutting him off from the king who had once been his closest ally. But even that wasn't enough. The executioners proceeded with the most horrific aspect of his punishment, the disembowelment. Despenser's abdomen was sliced open, and his entrails were drawn out slowly and painfully. Throughout the entire ordeal, Despenser remained conscious, his screams mingling with the cheers of the crowd. The disembowelment was followed by the removal of his heart, which was thrown into the flames, symbolizing the destruction of his corrupt soul. Every action was deliberate, designed to make him suffer not only physically, but psychologically. The final act in this gruesome spectacle was the quartering. Despenser's body was tied to horses, and his limbs were torn from his torso in a violent display of dismemberment. His head was severed and displayed on London Bridge, while the rest of his remains were sent to various cities as a grisly reminder of what happened to those who abused their power. The execution was a master stroke of medieval political theater, and its impact was felt across England. The aftermath of Despenser's execution was one of political upheaval and transformation. The Queen moved swiftly to consolidate her power, forcing Edward II to abdicate in favor of their son, Edward III. The nobility, once crushed under Despenser's heel, now found themselves elevated, their lands and power restored. In the wake of Despenser's death, England was reshaped, both politically and socially. His execution served as a powerful warning to anyone who would dare to challenge the natural order, to push the boundaries of power too far. Hugh Despenser's execution, gruesome and public, became a symbol of both vengeance and justice. His story, from his rise to power to his brutal death, is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the brutal consequences of pushing too far in the world of medieval politics. His fall was swift, but it left behind a legacy of terror and a chilling lesson about the fragility of power. In the twisted and brutal world of medieval politics, where loyalty could be bought with blood and power was often gained through manipulation and fear, few deaths have ever been as dramatic or as significant as that of Hugh Despenser the Younger. His execution, which took place in November of 1326, was not merely the end of a life. It was the culmination of a decade of political terror, a bloody spectacle designed to annihilate not only the man, but the very legacy of his ambition. Despenser, who had risen from the ranks of minor nobility to become one of the most powerful men in England, would meet his end not by the swift hand of a justice system, but by a gruesome public display intended to send a chilling message to any who might dare follow in his footsteps. For over 10 years, Despenser had enjoyed a position of unimaginable power. He had become the second most influential figure in England, his influence over King Edward II absolute. Through a combination of ruthless political maneuvering, legal manipulation, and outright violence, Despenser controlled vast swathes of the kingdom's wealth and resources, using his position to systematically destroy any noble who dared challenge him. His rise was meteoric, fueled by the weakness of the king, whose dependence on Despenser left the monarchy vulnerable to corruption. But the higher Despenser rose, the more his actions turned to cruelty. He destroyed the lives of countless nobles, seized lands, and stripped families of their wealth and dignity. His reign was marked by terror and bloodshed as he sought not just power, but the complete domination of England's political landscape. Yet, in the high-stakes world of medieval court politics, no one is ever beyond the reach of vengeance. Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife, had been humiliated and sidelined by Despenser's overwhelming influence. No longer willing to remain a passive victim, Isabella, who had long been marginalized by her husband's favoritism toward Despenser, seized the opportunity to escape to France in 1325. There she gathered an army, forming alliances with exiled nobles and disgruntled English lords, all of whom had suffered at the hands of Despenser's ruthless reign. By 1326, Isabella was ready to return to England, not as a queen seeking her husband's favor, but as a liberator determined to bring down the man who had terrorized her and England for so long. As Isabella landed in Essex, her forces were welcomed by commoners who had long suffered under Despenser's rule. The nobles once cowed by his power, now saw an opportunity for revenge. Edward II, isolated from his support network, was unable to protect Despenser, and the once mighty favorite was forced to flee. The Despenser's power was built on a fragile foundation, and when faced with real opposition, it crumbled. Hugh Despenser, now a broken man, was captured in Wales, his fate sealed by the very political forces he had spent his life manipulating. His capture was only the beginning. His death would not be quick, nor would it be merciful. It would be a carefully staged execution designed to obliterate his legacy in front of the very people he had oppressed. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger was more than just an act of justice. It was a political statement. Every aspect of his punishment was deliberate, a show of power, revenge, and public humiliation. Hereford, the town chosen for his execution, had significance. This was where Despenser had once enjoyed his greatest power, in the heart of the Welsh marches. It was fitting that his death would come here, where he had once been invincible. As Despenser was paraded through the streets, stripped of all dignity, the crowd that gathered to witness his demise was not just curious, it was filled with those who had suffered under his rule. The spectacle was meant to remind the kingdom of the price of unchecked ambition and the consequences of using fear as a tool of governance. The execution began with Despenser being hanged by the neck, but not until death. The rope was carefully adjusted to prolong his suffering, leaving him gasping for breath in front of a jubilant crowd. But this was only the beginning. Despenser, the man who had once been untouchable, was now forced to endure the worst form of humiliation. The executioners, carefully chosen for their skill in causing prolonged pain, castrated him in front of the crowd, an act that was both symbolic and cruel. It was a direct attack on his relationship with King Edward II, a mocking gesture that severed the unnatural bond between the two men. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy the crowd's thirst for revenge. The final stages of the execution were the most horrific. Despenser was disemboweled alive, his intestines drawn out while he remained conscious. This grotesque procedure was designed not just to kill him, but to publicly erase him from the political memory of England. His heart was torn out and thrown into the fire, a symbolic act that destroyed the very core of his corrupt soul. Throughout the entire process, Despenser screamed in agony, but his voice was drowned out by the jeering crowd that had gathered to witness his downfall. This was no ordinary execution. It was a performance, a gruesome political theater designed to humiliate him in ways that words alone could never achieve. The final act of the execution was the quartering of Despenser's body, a brutal display that would ensure his death would be remembered for generations to come. His limbs were tied to horses and torn from his torso in a violent display of dismemberment. His head was severed and displayed on London Bridge as a warning to all who would dare abuse their power in such a way. The rest of his body was distributed to various cities throughout England, a gruesome reminder of the cost of ambition. The death of Hugh Despenser marked the end of one of the most brutal chapters in English political history. His fall from power and the public spectacle of his execution had far-reaching consequences. It marked the triumph of Queen Isabella and her supporters, who quickly moved to consolidate their power. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of their son, Edward III, and the political landscape of England was forever altered. The nobility, who had long been oppressed by Despenser's reign of terror, found themselves restored to positions of power. Despenser's vast estates were seized, his wealth redistributed, and his legacy erased from the annals of history. In the wake of his death, the Kingdom of England had been transformed. The execution of Hugh Despenser was not just a personal revenge, it was a message to all who would dare seek to wield unchecked power in a kingdom ruled by law and order. His death, brutal and public, became a warning to future rulers and courtiers. Ambition without limit will always lead to destruction, and the consequences of tyranny will be felt long after the tyrant's fall. Hugh Despenser the Younger, once the second most powerful man in England, had risen to power on a foundation of fear, manipulation, and cruelty. But in the end, his own ambition proved to be his undoing. His death was not just a political event, it was a spectacle of justice, a reminder of the dangers of absolute power, and a chilling warning to all who would follow in his footsteps.